All right, when we left off last time, we had entered into the period in which Tiberius had rotated off the throne, and we had come to Caligula as well, and now we're hitting the point where Claudius is ruling, and we're really in the period of the development of the early church, as well as the beginning of, heading into the period of the beginning of the missionary work of Paul. During that time, one of the emperors present was Claudius. And Claudius ruled for 13 years. He was a capable ruler and administrator and expanded the rights of the people during his rule. He was probably the most, the most educationally sensitive or absorbing of the rulers. And really was a pretty good emperor, probably the best emperor that Rome had after Augustus. There was tension between, we think it was between Jews and Christians at this time, and in AD 49, Claudius issued an edict that expelled the Jews from Rome. In 49, Jews meaning Jews and Christians, both, because in the mind of Rome, there was not yet the distinction between Jews and Christians that was in the process of emerging in reality. It's important to remember that in these early decades, the early church saw itself very much as Jewish. They preached Jesus as the Messiah, as the completion of promise. And they went into the synagogues and they proclaimed this message. And in proclaiming this message, the message basically was, if you are a good and faithful Jew who's going to respond in covenant faithfulness to what God has been doing, then you will embrace Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. And in light of that message, then, pressure emerged from within the church, from within the synagogues rather, to exclude those who had a Christian message, and that eventually, institutionally, creates the completely separate structure and organization that we come to know on reflection as the church. Well, this tension had risen to a significant degree in Rome, and Claudius finally decided enough and sent the Jews and Christians in Rome scattering out into the rest of the empire. And Priscilla and Aquila, who we meet in Acts, are traveling on the road, if you will, in part because of this edict that was issued by Claudius. There's political intrigue still in the house of Caesar. Two things dominate Roman politics. One is political intrigue, and the other is raw military and political power. And Claudius ends up being poisoned by his fourth wife, who wanted her son Nero to rule. And she's eventually successful in removing him as an impediment, and Nero comes to rule. Now, Nero is the ruler who we think is ultimately responsible for the death and martyrdom of Peter and Paul. Nero is a very sinister ruler who is constantly having to deal with the pressure that's coming from his mother, who also is trying to exercise a lot of political influence, as her removal of Claudius already indicates. Early in his rule, he was pretty reasonable, but as his rule went on, it got more and more erratic. This is the Caesar of Paul's appeals. Interestingly enough, this Caesar, who's certainly among the more, notorious of the emperors, is the emperor who is in place when Paul writes Romans 13, where he urges Christians to be submissive to government because they are the servant of God and they hold the sword, etc. It's important to recognize that that statement is being made not when Augustus or Claudius is ruling and you have a kind of moral element and capable rule going on, but rather when a more notorious emperor is in power, namely Nero. Nero's responsible for the first extended persecution of Christians which shows up in our extra biblical materials in a report that Tacitus makes about the Great Fire of Rome. This fire swept through much of the city. Much of the city lived in almost tenement kind of housing, very much in squalor. Writers of the period describe how difficult it is to be an everyday person in Rome living an everyday life. Well, a fire sweeps through Rome, and Nero ends up blaming the Christians. And the first real persecution of Christians by the Roman rule takes place in AD 64. And Tacitus notes that Nero blamed this great fire on the Christians, and tells a little bit about what he calls the superstition of the Christians. When a Roman didn't like someone's religion, they called it a superstition. The aftermath of this persecution, probably for Paul in a second trip to Rome, led to their martyrdom. The tradition associated with Peter is that he was crucified, and that when he was sentenced to be crucified, that he asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to die the exact same kind of death as his Lord had experienced. And if you go today to the Vatican and you walk through St. Peter's in Rome, at one point you will encounter a painting, a very famous painting, in which Peter is being lifted up onto the cross upside down. His head's on the bottom end of the cross as they're getting ready to push it up and crucify him. There also is a church in Rome called the Church of St. Paul, which is an interesting church for a whole lot of reasons. But in it is the traditional burial site of Paul, which you're allowed to gain access to view. So if you ever get to Rome, St. Peter's certainly, and St. Paul's in particular, are two spots worth visiting, not to mention the Sistine Chapel, although I will tell you, when you go to see the Sistine Chapel, you'll go through a catacombs of rooms before you ever get there. This is one of those deals where they make you wait in line for 3 or 4 hours. You get into the line, you walk in, and then they take you through 150 rooms that you didn't realize you were interested in seeing, okay, until you get to the Sistine Chapel. So it is a very interesting place to see. But some of those rooms are actually worth it. Some of the more famous paintings of different aspects of Greco-Roman and actually intertestamental history are painted in the various rooms that they take you through. Now, after this persecution, Nero's family squabbles, if you will, eventually led into a traumatic form of his rule and led to civil war in which the line coming from Augustus was extinguished. And the trouble is that when you lose your family line as a dynasty, then all the other families line up to see if they can be king. Eventually, the Flavians won out. This is Vespasian. Now, Vespasian's job before he became emperor was that he was leading the Roman troops through the Mediterranean area, including beginning the campaign in Judea to overcome a Jewish revolt that had broken out in 66. But in 68 and 69, he was recalled to Rome, eventually came to power, and his descendant Titus actually is the general responsible for the overtaking of Rome in AD 70. And you can see that Vespasian ruled for about 10 years, and then Titus had a short, little over 2-year rule. Both were considered very effective rulers. And the Roman Colosseum, which you are very aware of from pictures of Rome and discussions of archaeology, the Colosseum, the beginning of its construction took place during this time of rule. Titus had taken Jerusalem in AD 70 for Vespasian, who went to rule when Nero died, winning out over a series of generals who contended for the role of emperor. After Titus came Domitian. Domitian was another one of these rulers who really craved power. He called himself Lord and God, even though the Senate opposed this in Rome. And this led to him being very paranoid. We've already suggested how, even though you're a ruler of Rome, you have to watch the political intrigue around you. And Domitian always thought that his life was at risk. And so he instituted a reign of terror to try and keep control and keep people at its distance and make sure enemies didn't get too close, that kind of thing. And this included the second period of severe persecution after the period of Nero. Now, these periods of persecution are important because they help to generate writings in the Christian church. The second round of persecution under Domitian is probably responsible for the emergence in part of the book of Revelation and the call to be faithful in the midst of the wicked beast that's in the world, which Rome, of course, helps to represent. In the context of the first set of persecutions, we get the emergence in all likelihood of the first of our Gospels, Mark, in which there's a lot of discussion about how to suffer and walk in the same path that Jesus walked. And we think that the persecution background of the era of Nero is in the background of the creation of that gospel. Okay, now I'm going to take you through a series of pictures to kind of summarize what we've been talking about. The picture in front of you now is the backside of a coin, which was minted to indicate the fact that the Romans had conquered Judea. And so you see the symbolism here of the tree and the two figures, one sad, the other dominating figure, picturing Rome's victory over Judea. This is a representation, it's not outstanding, but it's the best they could do, of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 that is in the Museum of the Citadel, which is the History of Jerusalem Museum in Jerusalem. And this is how they portray in kind of little figures the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. This is a commemorative arch. Notice Titus's arch, which commemorates the fall of Judea to Rome. And this is located in Rome. It's in the area of the Forum. It's actually between the Forum and the Colosseum. And this is certainly one of the more famous of the arches that still remains in the Forum area. And what's significant is it's almost completely intact. On that arch is the following image, and you can barely see it, unfortunately, but you will see in this image a menorah being carried out, which depicts Rome's entering into and sacking the temple and the submission of Judea as a result of Titus's campaign. Now, what were the effects of Roman rule? Well, one of the effects was that the large part of this period that we're talking about experienced what was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was largely a stable period. It was united politically. There was a legal administrative structure set up. Taxes were collected. There was a provincial structure of rule through prefects and governors. There was freedom, however, for local practice. All the Romans cared about was that there would be a peaceful coexistence with the people over whom they ruled. And as long as the people were peaceable and paying their taxes, the Romans were happy. The smaller imperial provinces were governed by prefects. That's what Pilate was. And they had the responsibility basically to keep the peace, to collect the taxes, to make sure that Caesar's interests were honored in the land in question. And in the case of Judea, the high priest was selected with the approval of the prefect. That's important because during the time when Pilate is prefect, every year he is prefect, Caiaphas is high priest. So Caiaphas and Pilate apparently have a decent working relationship with one another. He isn't going about the business of replacing the high priest. He is annually reappointing him. The Roman structure in Judea was helped by client kings like the Herodian family. The building of the aqueducts and trade routes, the road system, etc., helped to link the empire together and created more trade between the parts of the empire. This opened up the possibility for travel by Christian missionaries to take the gospel to various cities. Judaism had a place, and so often Christianity, as viewed as a part of it in Rome, had a place as an acceptable religion for much of the period, by which is meant, it doesn't mean that the religion was necessarily particularly respected, but it was tolerated, it was permitted. The Romans, generally speaking, saw the Jews as kind of a strange religion. They had a strange diet. They kept a strange calendar. They had only one God. You know, a lot about it was different for the Romans, but it was tolerated. And Christianity was seen as being an expression initially of Judaism, as we mentioned, and so the toleration existed and Christianity coexisted under that umbrella. There is much moral degeneracy in the culture, even though Augustus, for example, tried very hard to establish a moral kind of tone to the society. There's much religious syncretism. The instinct of a Roman when he meets a new religion is simply to incorporate it. It isn't a matter of choosing between. You want to stay in good relationship with as many of the gods as possible, and so you embrace any or all of them. By the way, that instinct is still with us in many sections of the world. This explains the emphasis on morality. The standard of pagan culture, the moral standard of pagan culture, or the lack of a moral standard in pagan culture, helps us to explain the emphasis on morality, the emphasis on exclusive devotion to God, in light of all the choices that are out there, and to Christ that we see in the epistles. And in fact, the choice to become a Christian in the first century would produce a kind of double alienation. If you were Jewish, it was seen as being a move away from faithful Judaism by those in Judaism, and you were socially isolated. And if you were a Gentile, it was seen as a cultural move away from the culture because you were moving from many gods to one God. And you were moving from a kind of oftentimes moral indifference, except perhaps among the more elite, to caring morally about how you lived. So all of this feeds the story of what we see in the New Testament, particularly in the vice and virtue lists that you get in certain portions, or if you think about the descriptions that you get, say, at the end of Romans 1 about the nature of Gentile culture. That complaint, by the way, that Paul makes at the end of Romans 1 is a little different than the way a Jewish person would complain about Gentile culture as well, in its idolatry and the impact of its idolatry. So that's the history of Rome.